Esta conferencia y la presentación del doctor Cameron me parece muy relevante por tres motivos. En primer lugar, nos da una perspectiva muy internacional. Él ha trabajado ampliamente en África, en diversos países de África principalmente, en varios países de Asia, en la India muy especialmente, y también tiene mucho conocimiento de Latinoamérica, donde ha dirigido un número importante de tesis, entre otros la de una compañera aquí de nosotros del colegio, ¿no? Pero dice que ha dirigido 3 tesis sobre México, ¿no? Pero también tiene tesis de Brasil y de otras partes. Ese sería un motivo, ¿no? Esta visión internacional. Segundo, yo creo que el objetivo 6 del agua, pues es uno de los objetivos importantes para nosotros, los que somos del grupo de agua de aquí del Colegio de Sonora, pero en general también yo considero que México es uno de los retos importantes, el objetivo 6 del agua potable y saneamiento, ¿no? Entonces él está en eso, ¿no? Y tercero, el doctor Cameron tiene una amplia experiencia. Él ya tiene más de 30 años trabajando en el sector. Es alguien que ha trabajado mucho con organismos internacionales, particularmente con los organismos de la ONU, y también trabaja incluso actualmente con la Agencia Internacional de Desarrollo de los Países Bajos, de Netherlands, donde tiene actualmente el proyecto. Algunos detalles de su semblanza, no voy a entrar mucho en detalle porque no le quiero robar el tiempo. Él es economista de la Universidad de Essex en el Reino Unido. Obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de East Anglia, también en el Reino Unido. Ha sido profesor de la Universidad de Erasmus Rotterdam en los Países Bajos, y bueno, ha trabajado ampliamente los diversos temas. Entre sus líneas de interés están el enfoque de capacidades a la pobreza y el desarrollo, está la evaluación del agua y el saneamiento, los proyectos de intervención o intervención de agua y saneamiento, los aspectos epistemológicos del desarrollo, el mismo concepto, los enfoques sobre el desarrollo. Ha tenido estudiantes de doctorado en Brasil, Chile, Ghana, India, Japón, Kenia, Malasia, México, Mongolia, Nepal, los Países Bajos, Arabia Saudita, las Islas Solomón, África del Sur, Sudán y Tanzania, y del mismo Reino Unido, ¿no? Él tiene una larga lista de aproximadamente 30 artículos académicos, es coautor de 30 capítulos de libros. Tiene 6 libros y diversos también capítulos de libros, ¿no? Como les digo, él básicamente es consultor, ha trabajado en agencias de desarrollo y ha participado en la evaluación de aproximadamente 250 proyectos de desarrollo en países en desarrollo. Como ya lo vimos, y pues no quiero ampliar más la información para cederle la palabra y que nos haga la presentación que él tiene prevista. Por si alguien no estaba al principio, sí me insistía el doctor Cameron que los que están más atrás pasen adelante para que puedan ver las fotos en el detalle que él decía. Entonces, please, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and thank you to the college for inviting me. My sincere apologies for speaking in English and not in Spanish. I do feel very guilty about that. I hope you'll forgive me. There is simultaneous translation facilities going on, but I see, yes, some of you are using them. I'm very pleased that you are using them. I hope I don't, I speak slowly enough and clearly enough that those of you who haven't taken advantage of that can understand what I'm saying. I'm going to talk about sustainability of water and sanitation projects specifically, and I'm going to take a particular case study, but I also want to draw more general points that would be applicable to any project, any developmental intervention. So that's what I'm aiming to do, that by the end of this talk you'll feel that not only have I talked about water and sanitation, not only have I talked about a particular project in South Africa, but I've also talked about how we can evaluate sustainability in any developmental intervention. So I'm being quite ambitious in that respect, taking a small case study and building it up to something that actually will talk to any developmental intervention in any sector. And it's for you to judge whether I manage to succeed in that by the end of the presentation. Okay. Let's first of all rehearse a little bit of history. Water and sanitation was part of the MDGs. There's the Millennium Development Goals that came to a finish in about 2015 and started off in the late 1990s. And water and sanitation had its own particular area in that, and which set a target of halving the number of people with inadequate water and with inadequate sanitation within the time period of the MDGs. In a sense, it sort of happened. It was, you could argue that water certainly was one of the more successful MDGs. There were considerable advances in availability of fairly good water at primary source, fairly large amounts of water at primary source for many more people than had been in the 1990s. So we can do a small tick to the achievement in terms of water. And I want to qualify that a bit, but let me leave that bit of success just on the table for the moment. Sanitation is much more difficult. It's a much more complex area in terms of provision, and of course it's surrounded by all kinds of cultural and social inhibitions, just dealing with sanitation. It's not a pretty subject, and it's more difficult to get responses in terms of sanitation than it is in terms of clean drinking water. So a more mixed response, are much more difficult to evaluate because the rules of the game of what is improved sanitation are rather unclear. So, in a way, so is it to some extent for drinking water. It's not altogether clear when people really do have access to an improved source that they are actually using in all seasons of the year and has a perpetual availability. So we'll need to think about that a little bit, about whether that apparent success has been slightly overstated. But the original goal, in a way, was very modest, yes? It was only to halve the number of people who had inadequate water, inadequate sanitation. That's not very ambitious in terms of a global system, which for those of you who are hearing the earlier presentation, you know, we have lots and lots of apparent scarce money around to say that we're going to leave people without safe water and without adequate sanitation. Half the number seemed to me to be rather a modest ambition, but nevertheless some success in terms of that modesty. We've now moved into a new set of United Nations goals, UNO goals, and that is the Sustainable Development Goals. And we'll probably spend the rest of the time talking about what that actually means and why we've changed the language. And it's a very, I think, an interesting question. But again, let's not go too far away from our main theme. Water and sanitation now features also in the Sustainable Development Goals. It is its own separate category, category 6. So water and sanitation is category 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, what's changed? Well, there's still some concern, I think quite rightly, with people getting appropriate quantities of water. We as a species are stressing our water supplies a lot. And you don't have to go very far from this meeting hall to find areas where water stress is occurring. We're dropping water tables all over the world. Groundwater is being exploited and being pushed down and pushed down. It's being, using that word, it's being mined. That is, it's not being replaced by natural rainfall in many parts of the world. And I think that might include Sonora as well, but I'll leave the experts here to inform me about that. So we still have a quantity of water question, But what the Sustainable Development Goals is, they promote above quantity of water, quality of water. They're becoming more and more concerned that even if the original source of the water is clean, that it gets polluted and contaminated by other forces, external forces. It's a real worry that we are dealing with people who appear to have clean water sources, but nevertheless still find themselves drinking low quality water because it's been interfered with from a variety of different directions. Industrial development, of course, polluting the water. Climate change producing floods that flood water systems, leaving behind unclean water. Droughts, of course, that force people to use different sources of water, which might well be contaminated. So many people are exposed to increased risk of drinking contaminated water. So it's understandable, I think, in that case, why the quality of water has to some extent been promoted in the SDG. If you read the numbers, it's number 3, rather than the quantity of water, which is now number 4. Now, I don't want to read too much into that numbering, but it does suggest a change in priorities. There's also an awareness in the SDGs that water is a multi-scale question, from the most local to the global. Where, you know, the effects of climate change on water availability, the effects of virtual water wars, which are happening on an increasing scale across the world, at the very highest level, the most macro level, right down to still the small village that has not got an adequate water system in order to satisfy the needs of its population. So we've got this awareness now that the water question is a multi-level question, from the very local right up to the global. And I think that's a healthy change in the SDGs, rather than confining its attention primarily to what we might call broadly the local. Another concern in the SDGs, which was mentioned in the MDGs but has become much more, I think, emphasised, is who manages water, who governs water systems, and how far can the governance of water systems be made more participatory, to really involve users, not on a market basis, but more on a governance basis, can involve users in the governance of water systems. And I think that seems to be firmer in the SDGs than it was in the MDGs, and I think throws up a challenge to us all, because we've all been supposedly experimenting in participatory governance of development interventions now for what, 20 years, 30 years? And we still don't really have an effective model of effective local governance that really works. So at least it's there. So we can continue. In fact, my present project is very concerned with the governance of water systems. And I think that's very appropriate, and that's there in the SDGs, so it's justified in the SDGs. So as from MDGs to SDGs, a little bit of shift, a bit of change, building on what happened under the MDGs, but looking to some new dimensions and some changing emphasis. Okay, let me briefly run through, I think, probably what is common knowledge among us here. People's lives are threatened by poor quality water and inadequate amounts of water, and they're very closely associated. Especially the lives of very young babies and very young children are, of course, especially at risk from poor quality water. And water is an important contribution to wider public health considerations. There are numerous ways in which people get sick from drinking poor quality water. Lots of bacterial and possible infections are waterborne. Issues like malaria, of course, have a water aspect to them, even though the actual vectors, the carriers, are not themselves within the water itself. And we're increasingly, I think, concerned about minerals and other contaminants of water, non-biological contaminants of water. I expect many of you have heard about arsenic being very prevalent among certain water supplies in the world, and there are other contaminants around which are also life-threatening or health-threatening, which are getting into our water supplies. So water is a killer. Bad water is a killer especially of babies and young children, but it's also a much wider concern. But strangely, what economists have found is that the real benefits, the economic benefits of improving water supply are not health. Isn't that really strange? It's actually time. If you price time into a calculation of the benefits of water and to some extent improve sanitation, but improve water, then that becomes economically much more significant. Now there's been a kind of casual association that if you improve somebody's water supply, you then move it closer to the household. So you save time in collecting and to some extent processing the water. So time savings are associated with health savings, a positive relationship between the two. So, you know, if you improve the availability of water, you're often moving it closer to where people can actually collect it. So that's an interesting question, and certainly it's one in which there's been a recognition that we need to build the time factor into looking at improved drinking water supplies. Because they're important in themselves, but if you're going to do the economic cost-benefit analysis, you actually are better off looking at the amount of time being saved than you are looking at health. That's partially because, of course, the diarrhea effects are concentrated on people who are often not in the workforce. Babies, young children are not in the, so it has this rather ugly economistic side to it, that it's because they don't count as workers, they don't count as labour. But nevertheless, then, you know, that's where the calculations lead us. So don't underestimate the influence of time saving. When you talk to an economist about sustainability of water interventions, they might well start talking about that the time saving are more important perhaps than the health saving, or as important as the health saving. But on a wider scale, we know water can be very important for poverty schemes, important for improving livelihoods, reducing uncertainty about where you can get water. Many rural households certainly are very uncertain about which source they're actually going to use in the dry season. And therefore they're perpetually aware of the fact they have to organise their family lives to fit with being able to collect water at the most challenging time of the year. So that you reduce that uncertainty and you have a chance of improving people's livelihoods. Many people are vulnerable to the loss of water supply. Another aspect of water which I'm very interested in myself is that water interventions can have a very interesting social effect. Water interventions are often an entry point for people working at village level, because water interventions tend to be the least controversial of the interventions you can make at village level. Everybody wants cleaner water. It's seen as being a community asset, a social asset, rather than just an individual family gain. So many people use them as entry point activities in order to then increase the sense of other activities that might be undertaken on a collective basis. So water has a social effect as well as an individual health effect. And we need to build all these understandings into when we assess the sustainability of any particular water intervention. Let me briefly then spell out some of the implications of sanitation. I say sanitation is a very difficult area. Interventions in sanitation can be right the way to a whole range of different technologies. And what those technologies often do is they change the distribution of investment. Clearly, a major sanitation scheme with shared sewerage requires a considerable amount of public investment, almost certainly. Much lower technologies in terms of improved latrines can be much more at the household level, in which the household becomes a major investor. So how the pattern of investment does vary depending upon the kind of technology that you're advocating, that you're intervening used. Cultural sensitivities are there in most cultures towards sanitation. It's not an easy subject and often discussed at a community level. But there are innovations in this. A good many innovations in terms of trying to persuade people to stop open field defecation are based on rationality. They are based upon a kind of health model. You will be healthier if you use this kind of sanitation rather than that kind of sanitation. Okay, which is one way. I've also seen though some very much more culturally heavy-handed approaches towards change, which are based on really on shame. That it is shameful for you to have to defecate in the open air, and you need to change. Now, those are, it's a delicate area in terms of as I say, that heavy-handed approach. Like water, improved sanitation is often seen as moving the facility towards the household and therefore saving time. So the time factor comes in again. And I think very important in terms of sanitation, both with respect to the household, but as much with schools as well, is the security gains for women and children, women and girl children. In terms of improved sanitation, often involves a more secure environment for girls and women, especially during periods of menstruation, but not only then, in terms of their lives, their quality of their lives. And I think that's a very important factor. Water and sanitation, certainly water has often been talked about in terms of improved school attendance. The amount of time that children, especially girl children, spend collecting water, when they do it, how tired they get as a result of doing it, is seen as influence upon their ability to attend school and their ability to perform in school. So water collection can be a discouragement both to attending and can reduce performance in school. And it is gendered. In many societies, the collection of water is gendered. It's a majority of water collection is done by women, especially younger women. It could be that water collection also affects girls' value. Girls as water collectors, it might be that that is perceived as a more valuable input into the household livelihood than actually sending the girls to school. And certainly that's another consideration. And if we send girls to school, all the evidence suggests that we get long-term social benefits. More educated, and I'll use educated in a broad sense here, more educated girls tend to marry later, tend to have children later, tend to have fewer children, which is good for their health in general, and also good for society in terms of those fewer children will tend to be healthier and more likely themselves to get education. And so the sense that there is a social benefit from improving water because of its effect upon the longer term of women's lives, long-term women's lives. That, for economists, is very difficult because basically economists aren't very good at doing the long term. They're very good at doing the short term, perhaps you could argue, but they're very bad at doing the long term. Once you get beyond about a benefit emerging of anything more than about 5-10 years ahead, it becomes valueless because of the so-called discounting principle that time in the future matters less than time now. Benefits in the future matter. So one of the big challenges we had when we were working for the UN organisation, the World Health Organisation, trying to devise a method for them to assess small-scale drinking projects, was that we had to look well into the future in order to include all the benefits. Similarly, a baby not dying, there you're talking about benefits that go for 50, 60 years into the future, which in orthodox economics is just forever. It might as well be infinity. So there were some interesting manipulations we had to do in order to include the benefit of saving babies' lives, which is a discredit to economics, I think, in many ways. Right. Now let's get to the centre of the presentation. I'm going to set up a case study, and I'm going to try and make you my co-researchers in this case study. This is a bit of a challenge. I haven't done this very often before, and it's a challenge to you as well as to me to see whether we can make this work. The context, you're now an international researcher, and you're researching a village water scheme in an area, a remote, very remote area of South Africa, right up in the north of the country next to Zimbabwe. And you're trying to understand whether this scheme is sustainable. What are the kind of factors you want to build in if you're thinking about its sustainability? And I'm going to ask you in a way to think about the general implications of what you're going to see. So you're going to get an image presented to your eyes, and then I want you to engage your brains with what you think you're actually seeing here and what the sustainability issues might be from what you see here. It's a bit of a challenge. Let's see how we get on. It's obviously a very strange environment for you. Let's see whether we can make some mileage. Okay. So there's the area. We're providing improved drinking water to this area. The main part of the households we're going to be providing water to are in the foreground of the picture. But let your eyes travel further on into the background. Okay, it's easy to focus on and concentrate upon the households in the front of the diagram. But what have you got behind it? A great big open space. Now, what tends to happen to open spaces when human beings are around? They fill. Yes. So, in a way, the original scheme assumed a boundary, yes? It assumed a boundary of who was going to be provided with clean drinking water. Perhaps, though, it didn't say enough about what might happen in the future if other households move into this area. Perhaps themselves, and they were, attracted by the fact that it was clean drinking water. So clean drinking water is in fact an incentive to in-migrate. So the scheme, almost from the very beginning, was likely to be underdeveloped in terms of the numbers of households it was supposed to cover. Yeah, so you can see that there, can't you? There's an open space. It's very arid, very little surface water here. Yes. So if you're bringing in a good supply of groundwater into this area, it's going to be itself an incentive for households to move into the area and attempt to attach themselves to the scheme. And that's what happened. Households did move in, and it started to put great strain. It started to make the water having to be rationed and produce a great strain between the people who considered themselves to be the permanent residents and those they considered to be migrants, who they felt were coming in to take their water. And the possessive pronoun, I think, is appropriate there, their water, and it wasn't to be shared in that respect. So what's our big development consideration there, which could apply to any project? What sets the boundaries for an intervention? What sets the boundaries for any intervention? And what's the implicit model in the intervention? I call it theoretical, I think it's the right thing to call it. What's the implicit theoretical model of future changes? Demographic, perhaps, or perhaps other kinds of change. What was being assumed in the intervention about what would happen in the longer term future, and how the intervention could stand up to the strain of those changes? So that's a question we can ask of any development intervention. Yes, what are the parameters that were originally set, and how were they going to be challenged by possible potential processes of change in the future? So that's the first general point. Spatial. Setting boundaries. Who sets the boundaries, and are they realistic in terms of their long-term future? Here's our second image. Okay. Our second image is of a woman, certain years, collecting water from a surface water source. What do you think about that? What does your research focus tell you? Add to that. Is she collecting water in a dangerous situation for her health? Not necessarily, yeah. Not all surface water is polluted, but quite a lot of it is.
What is the watershed? Is this located? Is it upper part, is it middle part, or is it down?
Yeah, that's right. That's a good question to ask. Where are we in the water sources, and what lies above, and what? Yeah.
Oh, mines.
Yeah. Yes, and mine. Yes, I don't know. That's very strong in some people's minds. Yes. Yes. Certainly in Sonora, there's a reason to be conscious. There might be a mine somewhere up in the hills there. So yes, so she's collecting water. In fact, she was collecting water to do her laundry. She wasn't collecting water to drink. She had to set another source of water, a cleaner source for her drinking water. But this water she was going to use for her laundry, to wash her clothes. So in a way, the initial supposition that her health is at risk perhaps isn't justified in this particular case. And what I want to do with that insight is to turn it into a question of agency. Agency is a very important word in development research. Yes? Who can make decisions, and why do they make decisions? And this woman is not totally powerless. She's not without agency. She's choosing between water sources for different purposes. In that way, she's rational. She's a rational individual making difficult choices under great constraints, but she is rational. And I think we have to be very careful about what the interventions assume about people's rationality. Why are they doing what they're doing now? And how will the intervention interact with their rational choices about what they're doing now? And that's what I always assume whenever anybody's doing anything, that they have a reason, and my job is to find out what the reason is, to ask them why they are doing something, not to assume that I already know why they are doing something. So agency in that sense is everywhere, yes? But of course it's not necessarily evenly spread. I'm not arguing agency is evenly spread, I'm saying it's everywhere, but it has its areas of concentration as far as power is concerned, and we'll come on to that later on. So my second general point about interventions is what is the understanding of agency in that intervention? What is the understanding of how decisions are being made right from the individual up through the family, into the village, and then into the wider society? How is agency distributed, and what does the intervention assume about agency? Okay. This image, if you look to the right-hand side of the image, there is a channel being dug, a ditch being dug, in which pipes for the drinking water system will be laid. So we've got some interference with land availability and land use. Yes, land is being converted, in this case, perhaps temporarily, but permanently as far as agriculture is concerned, into serving the drinking water scheme intervention rather than serving the household that was previously using it. Presumably the households whose houses lie close to the channel. So this raises the issue for me, the general issue. What happens to space? Okay, in this case the space is land. Okay, so that's a fairly straightforward space. What happens to space as a result of the intervention? What happens to the availability of space? The availability of land in this case? Who has access to the land? Has land been removed from some people? If so, have they been compensated for that use, that loss? If so, what were the basis of that compensation? How is the land valued? Has it been commoditized? Has it been turned into something that has a price? Was the decision to use this land, was that collective? Or was it made by an institution, an organisation, which simply secured the land? So most interventions involve a change in the dimension of space. They alter the spatial characteristics for a community, for an individual, for a family, for a village, for a wider, depending upon, of course, and we know experience in Sonora is dams have that effect, yes? Dams which create large reservoirs have effects upon people's lives and the availability of land. So we can go from the most dramatic, which is a large-scale dam project displacing whole groups of people, to a project like this, which is relatively small, but nevertheless has implications for the availability and the use of land. So this area is the area of space. How does the intervention interfere with space? Its availability, its usability, and its valuation. Important issues for many families and for many societies. Here's a ditch being dug. Women's labour. Very, very low technology. Just a spade and an unforgiving earth. How did these women come to be doing this activity? Did they choose to do it? Are they being paid for it? If so, what are they being paid? What's the basis on what they're being paid? How's their health as a result of engaging in this activity? Are there health effects of engaging in this very strenuous activity? All issues that we need to consider when we're thinking about an intervention and how it's actually working in terms of people, not just land, but people as well. There's an agonising debate in economics about choice of techniques, how techniques are chosen. And it created a great debate about, a long time ago now, 40, 50 years ago, about whether in poorer economies you should choose more labour-intensive techniques. So somehow it was efficient to use labour in a very labour-intensive way rather than introduce imported machinery. An interesting debate, one which really didn't get very far, but it raised issues about what people should be paid to do work. And with that it was associated the notion that when you're accounting for this kind of activity, you should put on it a shadow wage. That is a wage rate that's invented by economists rather than the one that's actually being paid to people. Now the technical arguments around a shadow wage are quite difficult, but in general it competes with the idea of an opportunity cost. What these women would be doing otherwise if they weren't engaged in this activity. It's a very complex matter of deciding what actually you should attribute, first of all, what you should pay these women in real money, and secondly, how you should economically account for what you're paying to these people. There's lots of technical issues around the use of labour and how labour should be accounted in any intervention. So I've left that as a very simple question. When we're looking at any intervention, what does it imply for the use of people's time? I've emphasised here time as being a kind of objective measure, rather than money, which I'm treating as something that's much more debatable. Time in terms of activities, and of course in terms of the rewards that they actually get as well from engaging in this. So that's my next category, is people, people's work. People's work in bringing the intervention into actuality. I think there's often an assumption by agencies, especially those that think of themselves as being donor agencies, that when they enter a village economy, they are somehow offering a free good. They're offering something that the village can easily take without any change in its activities. Well, here we have an obvious example that activities have changed because women are involved in digging ditches, but also more widely, when an agency enters a village, to some extent the village might reorganise itself a bit politically and socially in order to absorb the new intervention. So it's not just the act of labour itself, it's also how far the village's social organisation is modified by the presence of the intervention. A more indirect and less visible way in which changes in people's time and activity patterns change with the result of an intervention. So that's another consideration here. Oh, that's the scheme. We finally got to the fact that the scheme is in existence, and it does something, and this is the board that's proudly displayed next to the scheme. Interestingly, in this case, there's no other placard that says this was due to this particular politician or attributing it to a political process. It's just simply a technical matter. The question I want to ask here is who is controlling the language here? I mean, I would imagine for most of us in this room, most of that language is unintelligible. It's engineers' language, yes? It's engineers that are controlling the discourse around this intervention. And there's nothing here that makes any concessions to local people's knowledge or local people's languages. It's just simply an engineering specification. So you won't be surprised by my next general question then. Who controls the discourse? Very contemporary development thinking, yes? Who's controlling the discourse here? Whose language and what are the silences? Whose voices are missing? Whose voices are missing from this around the intervention? Here we have a very technocratic language. Yes, a language that's very obscure, very confident in terms of its claims to knowledge, but not very confident in sharing of knowledge with the people who actually are using the scheme. And there is no other written document around it. There's no other board that says, you know, this scheme is doing this and showing, you know, practical diagrams of how the scheme actually works to deliver all to the people. This is what they see. This is their description of the scheme as far as they are concerned. So it really is, in that sense, obscure from them what the actual scheme is about. There's no map showing how the water is being distributed, no other information at all, other than this board saying what the technical specification of the scheme is. Getting a bit closer to the scheme itself, that's the reservoir. Impressive, yeah? Real hard engineering reservoir, yes? Nothing's ever going to go wrong with it, is there? I mean, that's going to be there forever. The engineers have done their job. They've set up something that really does work. It's going to be there. It's solid engineering. But nevertheless, even though it is solidly engineered, and I have every confidence that that reservoir will be there for a very long time, it still needs, the scheme itself still needs operating and maintenance. So it may be hard engineered in terms of its physical design, but that doesn't stop it needing operation and maintenance. If you look carefully at the previous board, you would have seen the pump is on for 12 hours a day. So that means somebody has to turn it on and then turn it off. And there's one person in the village who's been instructed about how to turn it on and how to turn it off. And that's the degree of engagement of the community in terms of operating and maintaining the scheme. If anything serious that goes wrong, and we'll see later some trivial things also go wrong, there's no way the village can actually take control and maintain the scheme itself. Nobody has been trained in the technical operation of the scheme. To some extent, that's because it's so hard engineered, it's very difficult to see how you could train everybody in the village to maintain the scheme at its hard end, that is, its source end. So as we'll see later on, there's some interesting questions that emerge when we get to the other end of the scheme. So the question I want to ask here, and again I think it applies to any intervention, is who will operate and maintain the intervention? As we look forward from the moment when the ribbon is tapped and all the dignitaries move away and say, well done, we've got this wonderful scheme thanks to us, who actually is practically going to maintain and operate the system subsequently? And how accessible is it to the local people to actually operate and maintain the system? This scheme has opted for a very low requirement in terms of local skills. Just simply the ability to turn on and off the tap, really, every 12 hours. That's about it. But other schemes, you might argue, require more sort of operation and maintenance skills. And of course, it's about decision making as well. In a way, the local community is totally powerless in relationship to this scheme at its hard end. For them, they are just simply recipients. They are not active in controlling the scheme. There is water. There it is, pouring out. It's a communal water system, so the water points serve around about 20, 30 different households. And so the collective water points, people come and collect their water from these water points, and as you can see, it's quite a jolly scene. We'll talk about that in a moment. What I want to do though for the moment is emphasise that actually there is a moment in this scheme when the scheme is no longer in control of the water. The water here is pouring out of taps into containers. And these containers are not the scheme's containers, they are the household's containers. And there's a very interesting trade-off between containers that are good for carrying water as different from containers that are good for storing water. And when I talk about storing water, it's containers that can be easily cleaned. Jerry cans are very, very convenient for carrying water because it's just a single screw top. Water does not splash out when you try and carry it. You can seal it off and you can carry it on your shoulder, on your head, or as you can see here in a wheelbarrow, and it's not going to spill. Most containers that you can easily clean are vulnerable to spillage, vulnerable to losing water. Some, if not all. So there's a real trade-off here. And I think the increasing concern when people take samples from containers in the households that they are recontaminated. They are being contaminated again by the fact that the containers were not fully clean. There's an interesting kind of trade-off here, that the intervention in that last leg between the edge of the frontier of the intervention and the frontier of consumption, that there is a risk, there's a danger in that area, which I don't think was thought about by the designers of the scheme. If you take the water in pipes inside people's houses, that is enormously reduced. Because although even then, if the water supply is only intermittent, if it's rationed, then people will still fill up containers for the times when the water is not there. So the problem doesn't disappear just because you put taps inside people's houses. It does depend upon how regular the water is flowing through those taps. But what I want to emphasise here, and it's a rather nice picture, lots of young people having a good time, is the social aspect of this. The good thing about collective water points, it means that people still keep coming together. In many villages with collective water systems, people come together, they chat, they talk about life, they talk about their families, things get shared around, there are conversations. Once you put water into private houses, individual houses, that is removed. Yes, you don't get that same kind of social interaction. And there's a positive point to having collective water points like this, not just a negative point in terms of the cleanliness of containers, but actually a positive point. People are brought together socially. Those young people are socialising with each other, whilst they're waiting to fill up their receptacles, they're laughing with each other and joking with each other, telling each other stories about life and sharing a community sense of themselves. So I'm going to say that's a positive thing about having collective facilities rather than individualised facilities. Another tiny point I want to make is the gendered aspect of that again. Look who's got the wheelbarrow. Look who's pushing the wheelbarrow, and look who's carrying the water. It's a man who's got the wheelbarrow. He's got both hands on it. Any opportunity to capture technology, and it's likely to be the man that grabs it, yes, and leaves the women doing the hard work whilst he captures the wheelbarrow. Right. And if we're on to gender, there's nice, happy young woman, hopefully now taking the water into the house from a very nearby water point. Really was just 20 metres away. So she used to go to a river or to a canal half a kilometre away. Now she goes 20 metres and carries the water in. Looks like an improvement. She's able to go to school easily. She's less tired when she gets to school. So it's a good, you can say this is an unambiguous improvement. The trouble is the intervention is still requiring her to carry a heavy weight on her head probably 2 or 3 times a day. Physiologically, you need to think about that, yes? You need to think about the effect on that young woman's body of that kind of physical activity, with probably the moment of greatest risk when she's lifting the container onto her head. Not only, but that's probably the moment she's lifting that container up, but she's actually putting her body under very unnatural stress. And that could have implications for her future health in terms of her back, and indeed in terms of her ability to reproduce as well. Could have some effect. So we need to be aware that the intervention has been good in terms of it's brought the water closer, but it hasn't stopped a particular physical act which might be health and safety risk, a health risk to this young woman. So there's a question, slight question. So, are there gender and age considerations that have longer term implications? Have the intervention really changed the burden on women and girls? I mean, a good many interventions seem to assume that women have spare, and I'm raising my fingers and putting quotation marks around it, women have spare time and spare energy because they're not, and I wave my fingers around, at work. Yes? Often a totally unjustified assumption that women's time and women's energy is easily available as a spare, costless resource. So I'm sure everybody in this room is aware of that kind of assumption and how it needs to be challenged. I like this slide. Those are not my hands, by the way. Skilled water engineers' hands. And this is the far end of the system. And what happens at the far end of the system is the engineers lost interest. Just as it gets close to delivery to people, the engineers who have built this wonderful reservoir and this very robust pump on this borehole have lost interest. And what they've done at the end of the system, they've put a domestic tap, like you might find in a household. And therefore, with the heavy use that it gets from a whole group of 20 households trying to use this tap, it gets broken. It's just not robust enough to take the kind of strain that really you could have predicted. I mean, if you're going to put a tap in to serve 50 or 60 people with their total water supply, it's got to be robust. It's got to be almost as robust as the beginning of the system, yes? But engineers really often aren't interested in what happens at the far end. They like the big concrete stuff and the big pumps at the beginning of the system that have lost interest by now. And there's something else you could notice as well. Do you see the state of the pillar holding the tap?
Yep.
Yeah? Can you see the state of it? It's quite badly damaged, yes? Now, why do you think that is happening?
Humidity?
Oh, actually it's not a physical, it's not in that sense a physical process. If you're lifting a heavy water container, it's natural to do it in 2 stages. So where's the place you're going to rest it as you do the first lift? The top of the pillar where the tap is. So do that repeatedly, keep putting heavy water containers on top of that pillar, and you're going to chip it off. In the end, you're going to damage it. So again, another consideration where the reality of people's use of the intervention was not really of interest to the engineers. Nobody thought that actually if you don't provide an intermediate lifting place for a heavy container, people are going to use the pillar, the tap itself, and that in itself cause damage. So the implication is a clear implication. Have the experts really thought through this? And the closer you get to people, probably the less they thought through it. Okay, that's an assumption. That's a sort of an assumption. Yes, but the further you are from the big, exciting engineering end of the project, of the intervention, the closer you get to the people, the less really the engineers are really interested in delivering to the people. Now, I think that applies to other interventions, not just to water, but water, I think, is very vulnerable to this result. And it goes back a bit to the assumption about rationality. How are people really going to do this? How would a rational person pick up a very heavy water container? It's not particularly difficult to guess that they're going to bounce it off the pillar of the tap. Now, for those of you who are interested, we're now in the realm of, it might sound odd, but we're in the realm of Michel Foucault. Okay? All interventions need systems of discipline and punish. Misuse needs to be recognised, charged, and punished. And here we have an example of that. These people were putting water into to grow vegetables. And this is drinking water project. The drinking water intervention, you are not meant to grow vegetables as a result of a drinking water intervention. They persisted in doing this, and so a decision was made to cut off their water supply. So the people within the village, they would cut their water supply, was removed because they had abused, and supposedly abused the system. Okay, now it is a system that increasingly needs rationing. So there is a reality of rationing, and arguably where you have rationing, you need discipline. And where you need discipline, you need punishment. So there's a sort of rationale behind this. But we can ask ourselves the question, I suppose, why are there rules? And then if we've identified and say, yeah, okay, some rules are justified, what are the rules for disciplining and punishing associated with the intervention? So who writes the rules? Who authors the power relations and behind those rules? Who interprets the rules? And who enforces the rules? And in all those questions, we are in a world where, shall we say, there are opportunities of abuse, not so much of the water system, but of the rules. So abuse of the water system meets abuse of the rules in this kind of context. So, or have we sorted out as researchers? Have we really looked at what happens when the intervention is abused in some ways, or claimed to be abused? What are the rules of discipline? What are the rules of punishment of the intervention? The system is a public system. The water is provided free of charge to users. No charge to users at all. So it appears to be a public system. I'm not saying it's public good because the water is individually consumed, but it's a public system. But there is pressure throughout South Africa, as there is everywhere else, to privatise elements of any public system. So there are pressures to privatise. And in this particular scheme, for the moment, it's just taking the form of people installing water meters, which have the possibility of private charging. but private charging has not yet actually been instituted. So to get a water meter doesn't change anything other than it opens up the possibilities of private use. Private in the sense of paid for use, yes? And if you pay for something and somebody else is getting it free, what do you expect? I would argue, you expect to be prioritised, yes? You expect that you will get first access because you're paying for it as an individual. And so, is there an inevitable pressure, once you've introduced the first element of private use, is there an inevitable pressure towards increasing private use? And in any intervention, that frontier between public and private is always being explored, yes? Often with the pressure being to make it more private and less public. The risk of, I put here, a private sector capture of the resource, here by just a very slow process. But nevertheless, the threat is still there, that in the end the whole system will be metered and people will have to choose how much water they get on the basis of the ability to pay. Can they afford to pay for it? That's a pressure in the system. It wasn't there active when we were there, but it's a pressure. And lastly, what I would call the elephant in the room, there's the mine. The mine is close to the centre of the system. It uses water from the system. So it's there. It's, in a sense, it's part of the water system. It's not particularly planned part of the system. The system was designed for domestic users. But the mine sat there in the middle of the village. They say, well, we need water too. And so they were given a link into the water. And it's very unclear to me what the effects of the mine on the water system are. It was very non-transparent about how much water they were using. I couldn't work out how much water they were using. I couldn't work out whether they were having any effect upon the quality of water available. No, we're all conscious of that in Sonora in terms of the risk of quality of water. I've got no idea what the pricing seemed to be an arrangement between the mine and the chief of the village, the civil society chief. Didn't seem to actually be a matter of public record or a matter of contractual relationships. And yeah, it was very unclear at all about, in a sense, how the mine fitted in with the aims of this original public sector intervention. What is the role of a profit-seeking organisation in a system that was designed primarily for public welfare, for public use? Don't know. It's there, and I'm sure you know, even this relatively small rural village, this is a factor that needs to be considered. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Dr. Cameron. Creo que fue un enfoque muy aterrizado de un objetivo y considero que es muy aplicable a otros objetivos, en general a la pobreza, a los derechos humanos, a todas las cuestiones de hambre, cuestiones de género. En lo personal creo que me abrió muchas perspectivas diferentes que a veces las tenemos poco en consideración, totalmente enfocado, ahora sí como dicen en inglés, people centered, enfocado en la gente y con muchos aspectos en el género, y en ese sentido fue pues una cuestión muy enriquecedora. Algunas paradojas como la cuestión de las intervenciones, su relación no tanto con la salud sino con el tiempo y el género, la relación también con la salud. Vemos las cuestiones del espacio, cómo afecta el espacio, cómo reorganiza la gente, las cuestiones del lenguaje y la comunicación, los diferentes códigos que se usan, la cuestión de la operación y mantenimiento, la cuestión de el efecto en la comunidad, los aspectos culturales, los puntos de reunión de la gente, los efectos del transporte del agua, toda esta cuestión de cómo el tiempo que les toma, la edad de los que transportan el agua, digamos lo que llamaba, él ponía la atención en el género y la edad de estas muchachas, niñas que se encargaban de la transportación del agua, la poca atención que hay en los efectos, en los puntos terminales, ¿no? En esta cuestión de lo que nosotros llamamos las llaves de agua o los grifos, pero que pues también se pueden aplicar en muchas otras áreas que son del desarrollo, no más en cuestión del agua. Aquí lo que él llamaba el endpoint o el punto terminal, y pues cuestiones que a veces también por no ser de ingeniería no se presta mucha atención, cuáles son las reglas reales, lo que, bueno, en el enfoque que hemos aplicado muchas veces en políticas públicas, las reglas en uso, ¿no? Las sanciones, la disciplina que se aplica, a veces la presión social, y bueno, la cuestión de interacción con el sector privado, el mercado, el gobierno, la autoridad, los aspectos del poder. Thank you very much. I think it was a very enriching approach. Y bueno, abrimos un espacio para participaciones. Les agradecería que digamos, si gustan presentarse para el doctor, y bueno, me imagino que ya van a estar traduciendo las preguntas. How are you going to know that?
How am I going to know the questions?
Am I going to translate?
Yes,
I can just do it live. I can just do it live here. Yeah, you can say it. I'll repeat it.
Lovely, okay.
Okay, you're going to translate?
Yeah.
¿Vas a traducir o le dan un aparato a ellos?
Thank you.
Ok, entonces perfecto. Entonces, por favor, si hacemos una ronda de preguntas o comentarios o alguna participaciones. Algo que yo puedo decir es que a pesar de que él está hablando de Sudáfrica, en realidad yo siento que hay muchos lugares de Sonora que están en esta situación. Tenemos 50 municipios que tienen una población de menos de 10,000 habitantes, y me ha tocado ver muchas situaciones de estas. Hace 2 años estuve también en pueblos yaquis, y los pueblos yaquis viven situaciones tremendas que no se distinguen nada de esta situación. Parece, por vivir en Hermosillo, creemos que esto a veces no es de nuestro entorno, pero creo yo que sí, en muchos pueblos tenemos esa situación. Sí. América Lutz, bueno, mientras alguien más, si desea participar, adelante, América.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was great. Maybe we need to translate the other way around. I guess it's
English. Vamos a hablar español.
Please do it in Spanish.
in Spanish.
We'll switch now to Dr.
Usted habló de varios aspectos que tomar en cuenta en proyectos para fortalecer la sustentabilidad de las intervenciones. Entonces mencionó entre otros la cuestión de la agencia, la cuestión de quién controla el lenguaje y la cuestión de quién opera y mantiene el sistema.
So you talked about several aspects. One of them was the agency and
Who controls the language?
who controls
The language?
the language,
Agency language,
language.
operation and maintenance.
¿Quién opera y controla?
What ways to control that language?
Okay.
My question is there any difference? Because in practical terms, it seems that everything is controlled by the engineers, usually. I mean, who controls the language is them, who controls the operations and maintenance is them, and who makes decisions is them. So, conoce algunos. So, do you know any situation in which these 3 aspects are separated or they are located in different actors? Because my experience so far is that you have a group of elite people who usually do the 3 things. They control the language, they control the infrastructure, and they do also the maintenance and operation.
you're right in spotting that in this presentation, power comes in a number of different ways. Yes, but power is there. What I would point you to, I think, is when power is so overarching, when power lies so much with is so concentrated, then what happens, we need to look at the slide on discipline and punish. We need to look at deviance, because people exercise their agency then through breaking the rules, through twisting the rules, through manipulating the rules. People don't give up on agency, but what they'll have to do, they'll have to exercise that agency in ways that the controlling authority sees as deviant. So power lies to some extent with the deviant as well as with the so-called unified controlling authority. I mean, the basic feeling that people are basically powerless in the face of this system, it really, I suppose, is correct. But people have ways of getting around those kind of rules. And they've often put a lot of energy, yes, a lot of time and energy into breaking the rules, which is a kind of power. Yeah, you have to explain to the next guy.
¿Sí están traduciendo? Gracias.
Gracias. María Elena Carrera. María Elena. Mi pregunta es, por lo general, las mujeres en todas las sociedades estamos invisibilizadas. De hecho, estoy casi segura que cuando se toman decisiones de política pública, no se piensa en relación a lo que necesitamos las mujeres y necesitan los hombres. ¿Cómo es que usted arriba a esa visibilización en términos de la afectación en la salud por edad? ¿Cómo es que usted llega a sensibilizarse sobre esa necesidad en relación a las políticas del agua? Gracias.
Yeah, that's fine. I think, in answer to your excellent question, and I think water is probably the sector that is the most paradoxical in this respect. Women have an intimate relationship with water in a way that perhaps in other sectors is less so. And yet they are still rendered powerless in the face of authority. So I do think it's a sector where the paradox of gender inequality is almost as great as any sector. So we're going to see it most clearly, I think, in that sector. The sense of gender injustice between those who have need and those who have control.
How did you arrive at this?
How did I get to that? I think I'm going to get personal in this respect. I'm going to talk about myself a bit. I grew up in the UK, in Britain, as a fairly standardised chauvinist male. And it was only really with the gender revolution in the UK in the 1970s that I reflected upon and reviewed my attitudes towards women. Now, I'm not claiming I'm in any way perfect, but for me, it was a revolutionary change. And I remember in the early research I did with a group of men in Nepal, in another country, I became increasingly aware that we were neglecting the gendered aspect a lot. And by the time we get to 1980, I am fully aware of the fact that I need to include a gender perspective in every piece of research I do. So it's been a personal journey, and that journey still continues, because as I say, I'm not claiming any kind of perfection in this, but it is a journey I'm in a way willing to make, and was encouraged by women, friends and comrades to make and keep making. Encouraged is a good word to use. Often, it wasn't always that gentle.
Sí, Noemí, por favor.
Buenas tardes. Bueno, yo le voy a platicar rápidamente de un caso que es una localidad aquí en Sonora, que es el Molinito, se llama la localidad. Es una localidad que fue afectada con el derrame minero que sucedió hace 2 años. Entonces, en esas comunidades hizo el compromiso de construir potabilizadoras de agua. Entonces, la gente, al final de cuentas, lo único que quería es que se les pusieran purificadoras en vez de potabilizadoras. Pero por licitaciones nacionales se están construyendo las potabilizadoras. A mí lo que me llamó la atención es que hay una instalación de 5 equipos ya. Entonces, por ejemplo, en la comunidad del Molino son alrededor de 120 viviendas, una población de 600 habitantes, y pusieron un tanque elevado grandísimo, una inversión grandísima, y la potabilizadora está compuesta por 4 rotoplas de 25,000 litros cada una, o sea, una capacidad de potabilización de 100,000 litros para una comunidad de 100 habitantes. Pero cuando andaba haciendo la revisión, una persona me dice, oiga, pero usted me va a decir si va a funcionar o no. Ah, pues no sé, porque aquí no hay agua. O sea, lo que queremos, la petición explícita que hicimos es que se nos hiciera un pozo de agua, porque no tenemos agua, no tenemos resuelto el problema del abastecimiento. Por lo contrario, se nos construye una mega infraestructura que desde el cerco es muy costoso, ¿no? Se utilizó un cerco muy costoso, una sobreestructura, una sobrecapacidad para una comunidad tan pequeña, y que la gente no sabe cómo va a funcionar, cómo va a operar. Entonces, desde ese contexto, yo no tengo la respuesta, obviamente, por eso no le dije nada, pero me gustaría saber cómo desde la ciudadanía se puede construir, o qué elementos se pudieran retomar para construir o reconstruir la gobernanza participativa. O sea, que tuvieran inferencia en la toma de decisiones, que realmente fueran considerados en la toma de decisiones, ya que ellos no querían potabilizadora, ellos querían una purificadora de agua comunitaria nada más.
Oh yes, that is I hear that story very clearly. It's not uncommon. I wish it were, but it's as common. It's a story I recognise. It is very difficult if you've got a heavy end design, which is just being pushed by engineers with political support. It's very difficult to oppose it, even if you think it's the wrong design for your particular needs. Very difficult. I wish I had an answer to say, you know, there is an easy way to do it. I mean, it then becomes straightforwardly political, and then it has to be a political argument that's addressed through the political process, through the decision-making process. How successful that's likely to be, well, that depends, yes, upon the access to politics that the community has and whether they can really exert influence. All I can do is express my sympathy and solidarity with the fact that, you know, you are facing a situation that many people face. I think the combination of pollution plus an over-designed system which you're not sure how it's going to work and whether you can influence is not in the SDGs. That should be recognised in terms of the SDGs makes the right noises about community control, but I'm really not sure how that's actually going to come into reality. So all I can do, as I say, is offer my sympathy and my solidarity and just wish you success in a struggle that sounds like it's going to be a very tough fight to get control of your own water. I mean, it sounds strange, doesn't it, not to have control of your own water supply, a vital basic need, which seems to be controlled by others who don't have your own best interests at heart. I'm sorry I can't say something more positive than that, but I have every sense of sympathy and solidarity.
¿Algún otro comentario, pregunta para concluir? Sí, Ana.
Sí, yo quisiera ver si pudiera extender. Sí, yo quisiera ver si pudiera extender su experiencia en lo que es mejoramiento tecnológico y sostenibilidad. Es decir, A mí me ha tocado trabajar con sistemas de riego tradicionales y muchas veces el discurso de los extensionistas es la mejora tecnológica. Entonces quisiera saber cómo se complementan en comunidades rurales según su experiencia. Gracias.
Yes, I didn't talk about agriculture and the effects upon agriculture. I think the SDGs do talk about a water resource management kind of approach, which could bring drinking water concerns together with irrigation concerns. I think often they become artificially separated from each other because irrigation is seen as the province of the Ministry of Agriculture, and the drinking water is seen as the province of the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Infrastructure, and the two get separated from each other, and nobody adopts an integrated approach to the water resources in a particular area. So the SDGs do offer some opportunity to talk about integrated water management, which might be a possible way forward. In terms of ecological concerns, is that one of the major issue we're raising, about ecology, changes in the ecology?
No,
not that. I misheard.
No. It's about technological improvement. You show in your slides that sometimes the technology cannot be appropriate.
Not appropriate.
Yeah, I mean it's not sustainable in that way.
Yeah, but that's you picked up a theme there. I mean, what you get is you can get massively engineered input parts of an intervention, which really look like they're going to be there forever, but nobody local can maintain or have any sense of ownership of. And then you get to the far end of the intervention and it's falling apart because it's inappropriate technology, because it's too weak a technology. And so you get these strange combinations. I mean, the job of the researcher is to look at the whole system from the hard end to the soft end and say, well, what can be done about giving increased control to local people at the hard end, and what can be done about actually getting engineers thinking more realistically about the other end of the system. So, changing the balance between the engineering interest and the local interest, the participatory interest.
So technology and sustainability not always go together.
No, not at all.
It's the other way around.
Yeah, well, in a way, that hard end is sort of sustainable, but I mean, it's going to fall apart at some stage, and nobody's going to be able to repair it. It's going to have to be the system will just have to be totally revived. Yes, it'll have to totally rebuilt. So you're not going to get this ongoing set. So in a way, it's non-sustainable because when it comes to an end, throw it away and we all have to start again. Yes, in a way. Yes. So hard end engineering has a life, and any engineer will say that to you. Yes, I expect this pump to work for 10, 15 years, but often they won't talk longer than that. And the life of a water system, 10 or 15 years isn't very long. People are dependent upon the water from that system and become increasingly dependent upon it. Yes, giving up on other potential sources and not developing other sources.
Bueno, si no hay otra participación, quiero agradecerle muy sinceramente al doctor Cameron su participación. Creo que es muy difícil localmente tener los comentarios, las perspectivas que nos ha ofrecido el día de hoy. Me parecieron, creo que han sido muy enriquecedoras y creo que nos nutren localmente para los proyectos que tenemos. Les agradecería que les demos un aplauso y aprovecho para darles su constancia. Thank you.